I want to start with what it looked like on a Sunday morning in late August, standing at the edge of what had been, 3 weeks earlier, the best garden I'd ever grown. Every dahlia I'd cultivated for 2 seasons, every heirloom rose I'd sourced from specialty growers in Oregon and England, the climbing jasmine I'd been training up the trellis for 4 years, the sweet peas and the peonies, and the cutting garden border I'd submitted to the County Horticultural Society's annual competition, and won first place, best residential garden, 3 years running, all of it lying flat and brown and dead. The way plants die when something has stripped the life out of the soil beneath them rather than simply depriving the plants of water or light. The leaves didn't fall the way drought kills. They yellowed from the base up in the specific pattern of herbicide damage, the chemical working through the root system first and the visible plant after, which meant whatever had been used had gone into the ground, into the soil, into everything I'd built up over 7 years of composting and amending and caring for that specific 1,200 square foot patch of ground like it was the most important 1,200 square feet in the world, which to me, genuinely, it was. I knew immediately it wasn't disease. I knew immediately it wasn't drought. I knew, standing there in the morning with a coffee cooling in my hand and the particular silence of a garden that has stopped being alive, exactly what had happened and approximately who had done it. I didn't have proof yet. I'd have it within 72 hours, and the proof was going to be, by the time I was finished using it, one of the most satisfying documents I have ever presented to another person. But before I tell you what I replaced that garden with, and why the woman who poisoned it couldn't do a single thing about it, I need to tell you who she was and how we got here, because this story didn't start with herbicide. It started with a ribbon. My name is Petra Vanders. I'm 46 years old. I'm a high school biology teacher, and the house on Clearfield Lane, where I've lived for 9 years, is the first property I've ever owned entirely on my own. I bought it as a foreclosure, spent the first year making it livable, the second installing proper drainage and amending the soil, and started the garden in earnest in year 3 with the particular intensity of someone who has finally found a patch of earth they can do exactly what they want with and intends to make it count. I am not a casual gardener. I have a botanical library that takes up most of one wall of my spare bedroom, organized by subject with sections for soil science, plant taxonomy, pest management, and a specific shelf dedicated to cut flower cultivation that has 14 books on it, 3 of which I've read twice. I subscribe to 3 horticultural journals. I've taken a 3-day weekend workshop on soil microbiology at the State Agricultural College, attended 2 regional orchid society symposia despite not growing orchids at all, because the pollination biology lectures were excellent, and driven 3 hours each way on 2 separate occasions to visit specialty growers whose stock I wanted to examine in person before ordering. When people describe me as really into gardening, I accept it as accurate but insufficient. The County Horticultural Society's annual residential garden competition is a genuinely serious affair for a suburban county competition, with judged categories covering presentation, plant health, design cohesion, seasonal interest, and what the judges call cultivation evidence, meaning proof that the garden's quality is the result of skill and effort rather than favorable circumstance. I had entered 6 times. I had placed in the top 5 of those times. I had won first place in my primary category, Best Residential Cutting Garden and Border, 3 consecutive years, a run that had, by the August I found my garden dead, generated 3 blue ribbons, a small recurring feature in the Society's quarterly newsletter, and the kind of local reputation that is modest by any objective measure, but that mattered enormously to me, because I had built it from a foreclosure's compacted clay soil and 7 years of Saturday mornings. The garden faced the street on one side and was bordered on the other by a low wrought iron fence that I'd installed in year 3, beyond which sat the property of my next-door neighbor, a woman named Claudette Birch, who'd lived in Clearfield Lane's cul-de-sac for 17 years and who had, during the 6 years she'd been my neighbor, made it clear through a steady accumulation of small gestures and pointed comments that my garden bothered her in a way she found difficult to completely articulate but felt very strongly about. The objections had taken many forms over the years. In year 1 of the garden, Claudette had suggested, over the fence, that the dahlias I'd planted near the property line were a little much for what she called the neighborhood's general aesthetic. In year 2, she'd filed an HOA complaint, claiming the garden's irrigation system was contributing to moisture accumulation near her foundation, a claim that was investigated by our HOA's property manager and found to have no supporting evidence, given that the gardens were a full 11 feet from her foundation and the water flow moved away from her property. In year 3, the year I won my first blue ribbon, she'd come to my door the day after the competition results were announced and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that she supposed some people had more time than she did. I thanked her for stopping by. Between year 4 and year 5, the complaints moved through a predictable cycle. A complaint that the dahlias in the back border were exceeding what she characterized as reasonable height for a residential shared fence line, a measurement that, when B. Holloway came out with a tape measure, turned out to be 11 inches above the claimed maximum, which was itself not a number specified anywhere in the HOA's actual documents. A complaint about fragrance, specifically that the jasmine trellis produced a scent that was pervasive and caused respiratory discomfort, which B noted in her dismissal was a subjective claim about an outdoor plant with no mechanism for HOA intervention. A complaint about pollinator activity, which stated that my garden was attracting excessive numbers of bees and other insects to common pathway areas, and which B dismissed with a patience I genuinely admired given what she was being asked to evaluate. I kept copies of every complaint and every dismissal in a physical binder that lived in my filing cabinet, the kind of documentation habit that felt slightly obsessive at the time and felt entirely reasonable in retrospect. After the second blue ribbon, Claudette stopped speaking to me at all, which I honestly found easier than the previous arrangement. After the third blue ribbon, something shifted in a way I couldn't fully name but could clearly feel. I noticed it first in the way she stood at her fence line when I was working, not with neighborly curiosity, but with a particular focused attention that felt like calculation. I noticed it in the way 2 separate board members at our HOA's quarterly meeting brought up, unprompted, a suggestion that the association revisit its guidelines around garden size and visual impact in residential streetscapes, language that had the specific flavor of something someone had drafted before the meeting rather than thought of during it. And I noticed it in the way Dean Morrow, our HOA president, who had been cordial to me for 9 years, was suddenly performing a careful, deliberate neutrality when I was in the room that told me he'd been put in a position he didn't entirely know how to manage. I mentioned this to my friend and neighbor from 2 doors down, a woman named Yolanda Park, who had lived on Clearfield Lane for 12 years and who knew the neighborhood's social architecture the way a naturalist knows an ecosystem, who talked to whom, which alliances were operational versus ceremonial, where the informal influence actually ran. She listened and then said, in the direct way she had of saying things, "Claudette's been talking to Dean. I don't know what she's saying exactly, but I know she's been saying it more than once, and I know other people are hearing it." She paused and then added something that I've thought about many times since. The thing about Claudette is that she doesn't give up, she just changes methods. I took Yolanda's advice on 2 counts. I pulled the HOA's governing documents and read them carefully, marking relevant sections, and confirmed what I'd suspected. There was no provision giving the HOA authority to restrict a private residential garden on the basis of size or visual character, provided the garden was maintained in a way that didn't create actual health or safety hazards, which mine demonstrably did not. I also, for the first time, set up a garden camera, a small weatherproof unit I mounted on the trellis frame, angled to cover the full garden space and the fence line with Claudette's property, connected to a cloud storage system that archived footage on a 30-day rolling basis. I told nobody I'd installed it. That decision, made on a quiet Tuesday evening in April, while Claudette was presumably somewhere else being Claudette, turned out to be the most important gardening decision I made that year, which is saying something given that I also made 2 very good decisions about soil amendment ratios, and a genuinely inspired choice about companion planting in the dahlia bed. I installed that camera in April. In August, when I found the garden dead, the camera had been recording for 4 months. The footage from the night of August 14th to the morning of August 15th covered 9 hours of quiet garden darkness, the kind of footage you fast forward through looking for anything that breaks the visual pattern of stillness. At 2:27 in the morning, the motion detector clipped onto the camera's frame activated, and what the recording showed for the next 11 minutes was Claudette Birch, wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a garden sprayer of the handheld pump variety, moving systematically along the fence line between our properties, pumping the sprayer's contents through the fence, rails onto the soil, and plants in my border beds. She worked methodically and without hurry, as if she had thought carefully about what she was doing and had decided, in the particular way that people who have let resentment calcify into decision decide things, that she was entitled to do it. The camera caught her face in the motion-activated light for approximately 3 seconds as she turned to move back toward her own property, clear enough, unmistakable. I watched the footage twice, standing at my kitchen counter the morning I found the garden, and I want to be precise about what I felt in those moments because I think it matters. The first time I watched it, I felt something cold and clear, the specific absence of surprise when you discover that what you suspected was true is, in fact, true. The second time I felt something warmer, and I'll admit, considerably less dignified, which was a deep and genuine satisfaction that the camera had been there. That 4 months of footage that had captured nothing but birds and wind and my own hands in the soil had been there, running silently when it finally needed to be. I called Yolanda. She came over in 10 minutes, watched the footage, said, "Oh, Claudette," in a tone that contained more history than I fully understood, and then said, "What do you need?" I told her I needed to call the police, and then I needed to call a lawyer, and that those 2 calls were going to happen before I did anything else. Officer Ben Tran of our county's non-emergency complaint division arrived that afternoon, walked my garden, took photographs, and collected a soil sample from 3 locations in the affected area, all in the focused, unhurried way of someone who understood this was not a minor matter. When I showed him the camera footage, he watched it once without speaking, then asked me to play it again. He confirmed the footage showed a woman entering the area along the fence line and using a chemical applicator in a way consistent with the garden damage I'd described. He filed a formal police report citing criminal destruction of property and documented the evidence I provided. The lawyer I called was a property and environmental damage attorney named Claire Navarro, who'd been referred to me by Yolanda, who'd used her for an unrelated easement dispute 3 years earlier. Claire was quick, specific, and very direct. The footage is strong. The soil samples are going to be critical, because if we can identify the specific herbicide and connect it to a product in Claudette's possession, you have a direct evidentiary chain from chemical to hand to garden. I want you to also get an independent horticultural assessment of the damage for value purposes. Your county competition wins matter here. They establish documented market value for your plants beyond what a simple replacement cost calculation would show. The soil tests came back in 10 days, a concentrated glyphosate-based compound consistent with products available in commercial-grade formulations, applied in high concentration directly to the soil surface. The concentration was 3 times what a standard retail application would produce, which Claire said was significant for 2 reasons. First, it suggested deliberate, targeted application rather than accidental exposure or spray drift from somewhere else. Second, it suggested whoever had done it wanted the soil affected, not just the plants on top of it, because at that concentration, the compound would remain active in the soil long enough to prevent re-establishment of plants for a period that the horticultural expert I subsequently retained, a woman named Dr. Rhonda Gill from the State Agricultural Extension Service, estimated at 18 to 24 months without active remediation. 18 to 24 months. 7 years of soil building, 7 years of composting and amending and cultivating a specific microbial community that made that ground genuinely productive, damage to a state that would take nearly 2 years of deliberate restoration to recover if I chose to attempt it. Dr. Gill's assessment of the total loss, presented in a written report that Claire requested for litigation purposes, included the replacement cost of every destroyed plant individually, the cost of the soil remediation program needed to restore the bed's viability, the loss of the current season's competition entry, and the prize money and recognition it would have generated, and an estimate of the reputational value of a 3-time blue ribbon-winning residential garden, which Dr. Gill calculated using a methodology she explained in terms that were compelling enough that Claire read that section of the report twice when I handed it to her across her conference table. The total, $46,000. I looked at that number on the page for a long moment. Then I looked at Claire. She looked back at me with an expression that was not triumphant exactly, more like settled. "That's before punitive damages," she said, "which the footage and the concentration levels support, because this was deliberate, premeditated, and executed with a degree of care that tells you she planned it." While Claire was building the civil case, the police investigation was proceeding on its own track. The glyphosate compound found in my soil was a commercial-grade product sold primarily to landscaping contractors, not in standard retail garden centers, which narrowed the sourcing considerably. A search warrant, obtained on the basis of the camera footage and the soil test results, turned up in Claudette Birch's garage a partially used commercial-grade glyphosate concentrate in a quantity consistent with the application documented in the footage. The sprayer visible in the camera footage was also found in her garage, consistent in size and type with the one shown in the recording. Claudette was charged with criminal destruction of property. The charge was formal, documented, and based on evidence that her own attorney, when he reviewed it, apparently told her was substantial. But here's where the story takes the turn that I find, even now, the most satisfying. Because while the criminal case was proceeding and Claire was building the civil complaint, I was doing something else entirely, something I'd started thinking about the morning I watched that footage, and that had been taking clearer and clearer shape in my mind over the weeks since. I was deciding what to replace the garden with. And what I had decided to put in that 1,200 square feet of ground was not another dahlia bed, not another rose border, not another cutting garden that could be targeted again. What I had decided to put there was something that Claudette Birch, the HOA, and anyone else who had ever looked at my property and decided they had opinions about what grew in it could not touch, challenge, restrict, or remove because of what it legally was. A certified wildlife habitat garden, registered with the National Wildlife Federation under their Wildlife Habitat Certification Program, planted entirely with native species on the state's protected plant list, including 3 species classified as locally threatened and managed under a voluntary conservation agreement with the county's Natural Resources Office, which I applied for and received within 6 weeks of the original damage. Once that certification was in place, once those conservation agreements were signed, the garden stopped being a decorative residential garden subject to HOA aesthetic preferences and became, in a very specific legal sense, a registered conservation space with state and national documentation. The HOA's authority to regulate aesthetic elements of a certified wildlife habitat space under a county conservation agreement was, as the HOA's own attorney confirmed in writing after I submitted the certification documentation, essentially non-existent. You cannot cite a certified wildlife habitat for being the wrong kind of flowers. You cannot file an HOA complaint about the visual character of a state-recognized conservation area. You cannot, under any interpretation of the relevant governing documents Claire reviewed carefully and the HOA's own counsel reviewed afterward, tell the holder of an active county conservation agreement that their native plant restoration is too tall or too natural-looking or attracts too many insects, because attracting insects is specifically one of the certification criteria, and the county agreement specifically acknowledges it as a conservation benefit. I had turned 1,200 square feet of suburban garden into something federally acknowledged, state-registered, and HOA immune, and I had done it on ground that Claudette Birch had poisoned. Let me tell you how the planting day went, and then I'll tell you what the civil settlement looked like and what happened to the HOA board that had been quietly supporting Claudette's campaign against me. The planting happened on a Saturday in late October, and I'd organized it with the help of Yolanda, who brought 4 additional neighbors to help move soil amendments and plant 237 native specimens across the restored beds. I'd sourced everything from a native plant nursery recommended by the county's Natural Resources Office: native coneflowers, wild bergamot, black-eyed Susans, Virginia bluebells, native asters, woodland phlox, 2 species of native goldenrod, and along the fence line facing Claudette's property, a row of native elderberry shrubs that would, at full maturity, grow to between 6 and 12 feet and be completely, legally, uncomplainably there. Claire was there for part of the planting day, which she said she'd never done before at a client's property, but that she found she couldn't quite stay away from. She stood at the fence line, watching the elderberry shrubs go in, and said, almost to herself, she is going to hate those elderberries. I told her that was not entirely unrelated to why I'd chosen them. Yolanda planted 12 native bee balm plants along the front border, while her daughter, who was 8 and very serious about the whole thing, pressed soil around each root ball with her small hands. A man from 2 streets over named Tom Adler, who I'd never met before Yolanda invited him, turned out to have a background in ecological restoration and spent 4 hours advising on spacing and soil preparation with the particular focus of someone who found the project genuinely interesting. This is going to be something in 3 years, he told me, standing back and looking at the planted beds in the late afternoon light. You know that, right? This is going to be genuinely something. I knew. I'd spent 6 weeks designing it, and I knew. Claudette was visible in her kitchen window twice during the planting day. Neither time did she come outside.